As many of you know, I grew up in Houston. I am a proud Astros fan ever since '86 in the days of Mike Scott and Nolan Ryan. I loved my Rockets during the heyday of Hakeem Olajuwon, who actually just lived a few doors away from me back when we knew him as Hakeem. I was also a diehard Houston Oilers fan until they became the Tennessee Titans. And I only became a Longhorn fan when I attended college at the University of Texas at Austin in the early 90s. So you know a little bit about my sports ball allegiances. But what you may not know is a little bit more about my rabbinic journey. Now, you may know that I came here from serving a pulpit in Rockland, New York for 7 years. Before that, I was a rabbi in Baltimore, Maryland. But my first full-time position, not counting a high holy day pulpit in Vicksburg, Mississippi, was in Tucson, Arizona. I was in Tucson for 5 years, and as an aside, Emily and Noah were both born there. They are native Arizonans, but I digress. During my time as the assistant and associate for Temple Emmanuel in Tucson, I was involved in every facet of congregational life, including covering all life cycle and worship services when the senior rabbi was either away or on sabbatical. It was during my time in Tucson that I learned about rodeo Shabbat. During 1 week in February, Tucson likes to get its cowboy on in preparation for a week-long rodeo and celebration. To my Texas friends, it compares nothing like the Houston Livestock Show and rodeo. But in Tucson, they love it. At Temple Emmanuel, we did this by getting dressed up in our finest Western wear. Of course, being the Texan I am, I already had a cowboy hat and boots ready to go. Bolo ties were encouraged and spurs were always optional. It was during one of these rodeo Shabbat services, while the senior rabbi was away, that I got to meet and introduce our congresswoman, who was a guest speaker at services that evening. She was relatively new to Congress, having served in the Arizona House and later the Arizona Senate, before winning Arizona's 8th congressional district. Congresswoman Giffords could not have been more gracious. She showed up to services in her finest Western wear, and she certainly charmed the congregation. Being in a town somewhat similar to Omaha in both size and scope, I got to meet or bump into our congresswoman on a handful of occasions. So you can imagine my horror when not a year after I left Tucson, I heard of the tragic assassination attempt on her life at a Safeway grocery store where 19 were shot and 6 were killed. I shopped at that store. That was my congresswoman. These were certainly not the first political victims of political gun violence, nor, as we know, have they been the last. In just the handful of interactions I've had with some of you since the tragic events of a few days ago, I know this is on many of your minds. Yet I realize that it's been a long time that I've spoken about gun violence from the pulpit. I was looking through my notes, and the last time I addressed this was in 2018 following the tragic shooting in Parkland. Once again, it was not only tragic, but it was also personal, as one of the young victims, Alyssa Al-Hadef, was the first cousin of my congregants. In that sermon that I spoke about, I said, I can tell you one class they never offered at HUC was how to comfort a 14-year-old who just received the news that her cousin was one of the victims of a mass shooting. The cousin she used to spend summers with and go on fun vacations was now a blessed memory and would no longer be a blessed presence in her life. In this week's parashah, Ki Tavo, we learn all about the blessings and curses that are promised to the Israelites as they are about to enter the land of Canaan. Not only that, the leaders are divided into 2 groups of 6 to stand on 2 mountains as the Israelites pass through. The first 6 from the tribes of Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin stood on Mount Gerizim, shouting blessings unto the Israelites as they passed by. The other 6 from Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali stood on Mount Ebal shouting curses as the Israelites passed by. At the heart of these blessings and curses is the principle of what happens to the Israelites if they chose to follow the mitzvot, or if they chose not to do so. Or to put it another way, these blessings and curses are really both a reminder and also a forewarning about what happens when a society lives up to its ideals versus what happens when it ignores its responsibilities. When it comes to the recent shootings, including Charlie Kirk, as well as the students at Evergreen High School in Colorado, including victim Matthew Silverstone, who at the writing of this still remains in critical condition, I have no words. I have no answers. All I have is deep, abiding sorrow. But like so many, the sorrow has turned into anger. Can't help but ask, when will we as a nation finally accept that our chatat, our collective sin against our young people, against the poor, against people of color, against victims of domestic violence, and the list goes on and on. When will we say enough? We can do something to curb the preponderance of gun violence in our society. But Rabbi, you are now bordering on the political. And I don't come to synagogue to hear political sermons. Fair point. Except preventing gun violence is not only a human issue, it's also a Jewish issue. The ultimate mitzvah in our tradition is pekuach nefesh, to save a life. This mitzvah overrides almost every other commandment issued by the rabbis in the Torah. A doctor can work on Shabbat for the sake of pekuach nefesh. An ambulance can drive on Shabbat for the sake of pekuach nefesh. A policeman can patrol on Shabbat for the sake of pekuach nefesh. All of this is because, as the rabbis teach us, if we save a single life, it is as if we would save the world. But Rabbi, you are just against guns. Also not true. I grew up in Texas, the embodiment of gun culture. I can recall one Easter, because that's when you go, going to a gun range. We went there because my brother had a friend's BB gun that he disassembled and took it to a congregant who was a Vietnam vet. And the Vietnam vet said, I will reassemble this gun, but you have to come with me to a gun range to learn proper gun safety. And so, like what so many Jews in Texas do, we went to the gun range on Easter. And there we shot a World War I German Mauser, a .356 Magnum, and even an Uzi. And I still remember to this day, my father, a rabbi, with his hat turned around, shooting a gun on the gun range. It was thrilling and scary and loud, but it helped me to appreciate what I held in my hand. It helped me to appreciate that guns are not tools. Guns are weapons whose sole design, whose sole purpose is to kill. And they are very effective at it. This is why they are so very popular. If they weren't as effective, people wouldn't own them. Why do you think swords fell out of popularity with the rise of gunpowder? It is much harder to kill with a sword than with a gun. And even our tradition states that when someone threatens to kill you, you may prevent being killed by slaying the person before harm befalls you. But the argument here is not about self-defense. What is missing from the conversation is something Judaism so fiercely advocates, which is personal obligation and responsibility over rights. The term rights does not exist in the Jewish lexicon. Instead, we hear over and over again, even in this Torah portion, about the obligations of the individual and the community to fulfill the mitzvot. Or to put it another way, if we as a society decide that people can have guns, how then can we work to ensure that our society prevents them from misusing them? As Gabby Giffords, as her friends and former constituents know her, wrote in an op-ed, I mourn for Charlie Kirk's family. I didn't agree with almost anything he said, but he had a right to speak. Just as he had a right to go on a work trip and return safely to his family and 2 young children at the home in the state we share, Arizona. Just as Melissa Hortman, the Speaker of the Minnesota State Legislature, deserved to be safe at home with her husband and her dog. Instead, they were all 3 shot dead together in one night in June. Just as President Donald Trump had the right to campaign without fear of being assassinated, as two different people tried to do last summer. Just as I, Gabby Giffords, had the right to meet with my constituents safely on January 8, 2011, the day when instead I, a young congresswoman in a purple district, was nearly assassinated. 18 other people were shot, and 6 were killed. Our stories are unique, but what Charlie Kirk, President Trump, Melissa Hortman, and I all have in common is that someone who wanted to kill us had a gun. We can and should talk about political violence and its toxic relationship to political rhetoric. We can and must talk about social media's role in these moments. We all, as individual Americans, need to do a better job considering our words and their impact. But anyone who responds to preventable tragedies like this, tragedies that over time begin to erode the very fabric of our country by refusing to face the problem of gun violence and crime head on, is missing the point. What we share and what puts us all in danger, from elected leaders to little children, like those shot while praying in a church in Minnesota a few weeks ago, is the overwhelming prevalence of guns in this country and the loopholes that making it appallingly easy for dangerous people to access them. Now I know, my friends, I'm mostly preaching to the choir, and we are almost all frustrated by the continued lack of action. But what is really even more fascinating and disheartening is that the vast majority of Americans agree on common sense measures to help curb gun violence and to keep these weapons out of the hands of the people who should not have access to them. And because of this lack of action, we are not immune or unaffected. Instead, we are disheartened and feel a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Today, we are symbolically standing at the precipice between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. We too can see and hear the blessings and the curses. The curses were never intended to cause the Israelites to fall into despair, but instead were to remind them that it was through their choices and their actions they could, in a way, help determine their own fates. Yes, the politics of today are ugly, they are divisive, and they are cruel. But we have lived through such times before, including the 1960s, where it seemed that political gun violence was running rampant. And though we did find a way forward, we just need to begin or continue to do the sacred work that needs to be done. In their book, Jewish Dimensions of Social Justice, Albert Vorspan and David Saperstein argue no one claims that gun control legislation is the neat and total solution to violence and crime. But the fact that it does cut down both on the incident of crimes in which guns are involved and the general rate of violent crimes. But it does mean we have to fight against the curses. It means we have to do the hard advocacy work, even if it doesn't always look like it will bear fruit. What we cannot do is give up hope. None of this is acceptable. None of it is okay. None of it should ever be considered normal or just the cost of the Second Amendment. As Jews, we are uniquely situated to remind our larger society that with rights also come responsibilities. And if we can get our society to at least understand that, if not agree to it, then we can count that among the blessings we were so commanded to bring out into the world. And we can do that through the continued advocacy work necessary to help curb, if not end, the preponderance of gun violence in our world. And if you want to know more, I encourage you to go to the URJ Religious Action Center's website, who not only gives some very sobering statistics, but also ways you can make a difference to help end the scourge, this plague of gun violence, atrocities in our nation. I pray we find the strength to march together and do the sacred work and inspire the world to join us in helping to save lives rather than to mourn the lives that should not have been lost. Shabbat Shalom.